John Miller had always been the kind of man people noticed without really seeing him. A fixture of Chesterfield, but like the peeling paint on the old town buildings, he was easily ignored. He was in his mid-40s now, with salt and pepper hair that had begun to thin at the temples and eyes that looked perpetually weary, as though the world had worn him down one moment at a time. His clothes were always the same, well-worn slacks, a faded sweater, shoes that had seen better days. He worked in the town library, a crumbling building tucked away at the far end of Main Street. Most days, it felt as though the books inside gathered dust just as quickly as the town forgot him. Despite his unassuming presence, John couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong for a long time. It was as though a distant part of his mind had become aware of an intruder, a presence just beyond his reach. It was nothing he could describe, just an overwhelming sense of unease that crawled up his spine every time the sun dipped below the horizon. He often found himself glancing over his shoulder as though expecting to see someone, or something, standing behind him. At night, the house his late uncle had left him became suffocatingly silent. The old wood creaked, as if trying to speak to him, but he never quite heard what it was trying to say. He could almost feel the air grow colder, thicker, and that's when he'd start looking over his shoulder more frequently. The shadows in the corners seemed to lengthen, stretching toward him like dark fingers reaching out of the past. But when he turned around, there was nothing there, nothing but the silence that seemed to be growing. The first time John noticed the shadow, he thought it was a trick of the light. He had just come home from the library, his worn shoes shuffling on the wooden floor of his old house, and was tired, perhaps more so than usual. The house was dark, as it always was when the evening settled in. He reached up to flick the light switch in the hall, but before the dim yellow glow filled the space, he caught a glimpse of something in the hallway mirror, something out of place. It wasn't his reflection staring back at him, not quite. At first, he thought it was simply the angle, his tired eyes playing tricks. But when he blinked, the shadow was still there, stretched out behind him. It was as if something, or someone, was standing just beyond his shoulder, lurking in the corner of the glass. John whipped around, heart thudding, but no one was there. He pressed his palm to his forehead, rubbed his eyes, and cursed under his breath. He wasn't a man given to superstition. But this felt different. For a few nights, it remained the same, flickers of that shape appearing at the periphery of his vision, in the mirrors, the windows, always just behind him, always separate from him, yet somehow tied to his every movement. Sometimes it was blurry, more of a shadowy blur than a shape, but always present, always following. It was as though whatever it was wanted him to see it, just enough to make him question his own sanity. One evening, after a long day of sorting through dusty, forgotten volumes at the library, John stood before the full-length mirror in his hallway. He tried not to look. He told himself it was nothing, just another trick of light, or a tired mind. But when his eyes flitted back to the glass, there it was again. The shadow, larger this time, more defined. Its shape was slightly out of focus, yet he could make out the edges, the dark, stretching form of a figure that seemed to breathe in the reflection of the room. A part of him wanted to scream, but another part, the rational part, simply turned away. He muttered something under his breath and hastily walked past the mirror, avoiding it as if it might reach out and pull him back. He thought it would fade, that it was just an odd moment, the result of too much time alone in the house. But as the days went on, the shadow became more insistent. It followed him. At first, he thought it was simply his imagination. He'd catch glimpses of it when he passed by windows, mirrors, even the television screen. But there was something undeniably real about it. It never seemed to leave, always lurking in the background, like a dark presence waiting to be noticed. John became aware of it in every room. The bathroom mirror, the kitchen window, even in the reflection of his own eyeglasses when he caught sight of them. Every time he turned his head, the shadow remained, never quite as large, but always right behind him, just out of reach. At times, when he stood before the mirror, he could almost feel it breathing down his neck, the faintest chill brushing his skin. It wasn't just there physically, either. It felt like it was in his mind. The longer it stayed, the more it gnawed at him. He started to avoid the mirrors, the windows, any reflective surface he could. But it was useless. The shadow had become too familiar. It knew his every move. The fleeting moments when it disappeared, he found himself looking around frantically, almost hoping it was gone for good. But that hope was fleeting, too. The shadow always returned, as if mocking him for daring to believe it could ever leave. Sleep became a distant memory. John spent his nights staring at the ceiling, the covers twisted around his legs, as he listened to the silence of the house. The shadow was always there, even if he couldn't see it. He could feel it. He could feel its weight in the air. It made the house seem smaller, like the walls were closing in on him. He couldn't get away from it, not in his dreams, not even in the comfort of his own bed. It wasn't just the mirrors now, it was the way the house felt. The silence was unbearable, thick with the sense of being watched. He'd find himself rushing from room to room, never pausing long enough to glance at any reflective surface. And yet, the shadow seemed to follow his every step. In the hallway, in the kitchen, even in the bathroom as he splashed water on his face, it was there, just behind him. His heart raced as he tried to convince himself it was nothing, that it couldn't be real. But the nagging presence, the unshakable feeling that something was always watching, had started to break him. One night, he couldn't take it anymore. The pressure of it all, the constant sensation of eyes upon him, the relentless presence just behind him, had become too much. He found himself staring into the bathroom mirror, his hands gripping the edge of the sink so tightly his knuckles turned white. The shadow was back. This time, it was clear. So clear. And that's when he saw it. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just a shadow. It was a figure. A tall, dark shape that moved with him, mirroring his every motion, yet it wasn't quite him. The shape was distorted, too thin, too long, with arms that stretched beyond what was humanly possible. John gasped, stepping back from the mirror. But when he turned around, the figure didn't disappear. It stood right there, in the reflection of the bathroom door, as though the glass had become a portal into a world just behind him. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a trick of the light. This wasn't his tired mind playing games. There was something here, something that didn't belong. John had been avoiding mirrors, windows, and anything reflective for weeks. The shadow seemed to follow him, a constant, oppressive presence, and he could no longer ignore the gnawing terror that had burrowed into his chest. It was as if the very walls of his house had become stained by it, like the shadow had seeped into the wood and the paint, an inescapable infection. He'd never felt this way before, like he was being slowly suffocated by an invisible force. But his fear was no longer just about what he could see. It had grown beyond the mirrors. Every day, it seemed the shadow crept closer, creeping into the corners of his mind, eating away at his sanity. It wasn't just in the reflection of his face anymore. It was in the feel of the house, in the air, in the stillness. It had become a part of him, and he could feel its weight pressing down on him with each passing moment. John needed help, but he couldn't bring himself to tell anyone the full truth. How could he explain this to anyone without sounding like a madman? No one would believe him. The town already looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and pity. He couldn't bear the thought of becoming more of a pariah. But the darkness inside him was eating him alive, and he had nowhere else to turn. After days of tossing and turning, unable to sleep or shake the constant feeling of being watched, John found himself standing in front of Dr. Samuel Rhodes's office. Dr. Rhodes was known for his work with abnormal phenomena, and while John wasn't sure what exactly he expected, he had reached the point where he'd try anything. The psychologist's office was tucked away on the edge of town, an old stone building that seemed to have stood for generations. The walls inside were lined with books on psychology, dream analysis, and strange, obscure topics that John couldn't even begin to understand. Dr. Rhodes was a tall man with salt and pepper hair, his glasses perched low on his nose as he glanced up at John. He had the air of someone who had seen and heard it all, someone who understood the murky depths of the human mind. But when John explained what had been happening to him, there was no mockery in the doctor's eyes, just a knowing, almost pitying look. "You're not the first to experience this, John," Dr. Rhodes said quietly, leaning back in his chair. "The shadow you're seeing, it's not just a figment of your imagination. It's real, but not in the way you think." John's heart began to pound in his chest. "What do you mean?" Dr. Rhodes paused, choosing his words carefully. "The shadow you see is a manifestation of your own psyche. It's a physical representation of all the parts of yourself you can't confront, your deepest fears, your guilt, the things you've buried in your mind. It's not just something outside of you, John. It's part of you. It's the reflection of everything you've refused to face." John felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. His mouth went dry, and he struggled to swallow. The doctor's words echoed in his head, reverberating in a way that made his stomach churn. "I don't understand," he said hoarsely, his voice trembling. "Are you saying that I'm imagining this? That I'm just seeing things?" Dr. Rhodes leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of him, his eyes locked onto John's with an intensity that made him uneasy. "It's not imaginary, John, but it's not supernatural either. The shadow is your psyche, your unconscious mind made physical. Everyone has one. It's a part of human nature. It's our darkness, our regrets, our fears, and our weaknesses. Most people never see it, but you have, and now it's become a part of your reality. John sat back, his mind racing. He couldn't deny it. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. The shadow had always been there, lurking at the edges of his vision, haunting him in ways he couldn't understand. It had been a presence, almost a person, for as long as he could remember, but now it had taken on a life of its own. "I don't know what you're talking about," John said, shaking his head as though trying to clear it. "I don't have any dark secrets. I don't have any guilt." Dr. Rhodes's expression softened, as though he'd been expecting this. "You might not realize it, but you do. Everyone does. Something from your past, something you've never fully confronted. That's what the shadow represents. And it's growing because you're refusing to face it." John felt his pulse quicken. The words hit too close to home. He thought of his uncle's death, the death he hadn't been able to grieve, the guilt he had buried deep within himself, the shame he'd never shared with anyone. Was that what the shadow represented? Was it his uncle's death, haunting him for years? As if on cue, the air in the room seemed to thicken. John's skin prickled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He looked toward the window, where the sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting strange shadows across the floor. His eyes flicked to the mirror on the wall, where he saw, for just a split second, the shadow again, stretching long and dark, a twisted reflection of his own form. It was everywhere. The doctor's voice broke through his racing thoughts. "John, you need to confront it. You can't outrun it. It's only going to grow stronger the longer you ignore it." The room felt colder suddenly. John's breath became shallow as the realization struck him like a slap to the face. The shadow wasn't just in the mirrors anymore. It was in the paintings on the walls, in the windows, in the faint glow of the light bulbs overhead. It had infiltrated every corner of his life. And worse, it was no longer content to stay hidden in the reflections. It was now in the very air he breathed. John closed his eyes, hoping to block out the growing weight of it. But even with his eyes shut, the shadow was there, looming larger and darker than ever. It had become a force that was impossible to ignore. It was no longer just something he saw in the glass. It was within him, creeping through the walls of his mind, tightening its grip. Dr. Rhodes's voice seemed distant now, a faint echo in the chaos of John's thoughts. "You have to confront it, John. You can't let it consume you." But the truth had already sunk in, deeper than any shadow ever could. The shadow wasn't just following John, had always been a man who liked to keep his head down. He avoided confrontation, kept his emotions buried beneath layers of self-control, and prided himself on living a life that was, if not happy, at least simple. But simplicity had come at a price, one he wasn't willing to pay until now. And now, the price was coming due. The shadow had grown too strong to ignore. It was no longer a mere reflection or fleeting presence. It had become his constant companion, lurking in every room, every corner, every crack in the walls. The house, once a familiar and almost comforting space, had become a prison. The dark form stretched and contorted, now towering over him, blocking out the sunlight. It was as if the shadow had taken on a life of its own, consuming everything in its path, his mind, his soul, his very sense of reality. John could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was the shadows doing. He would walk into the living room, and the room would twist around him, the walls pulsating as though alive, the floor rippling like a dark sea. Sometimes the furniture seemed to move, and the floor creaked under his weight in ways it had never done before. The windows, which once provided a comforting view of the outside world, now seemed to warp, showing only dark, swirling mist beyond the glass. His own reflection, whenever he dared look, had ceased to match the man he thought he knew. He would see himself, but the face staring back at him was cold, hollow-eyed, a shadow of what he was. And the shadow, it was always there, looming behind him. It wasn't just in mirrors anymore. It was in his skin, in his blood. It moved with him, around him, through him. It owned him. And somewhere deep in his bones, he knew he was no longer in control. One night, after another fitful night of tossing and turning, John found himself standing in the middle of his living room. The room was shrouded in a cold, damp air, the kind that made his skin crawl. The shadow was there, but this time it wasn't just a dark form lurking in the periphery of his vision. It had grown larger, more defined, more real. It stood in the center of the room, towering over him, its shape more solid now, its edges sharp and jagged like a massive, contorted figure made of nothing but darkness. John's breath hitched as he stared at it, a growing sense of terror clutching at his chest. It had no face, no eyes, but he could feel its presence in every fiber of his being. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a reflection of his own fears, his guilt, the sins he had buried deep inside for years. It was his past, his regrets, and they were coming for him, wrapping around him like an iron chain, pulling him into a place he could never escape. The air in the room seemed to freeze, the temperature dropping so low that John could see his own breath. The shadow loomed closer, its mass shifting, bending, as if it were alive, breathing in time with his own labored breaths. And then it spoke. John's stomach lurched as the voice rumbled from the shadow, a voice that sounded familiar, too familiar. It was his voice, but it wasn't his voice. It was distorted, twisted by the weight of his own guilt, dripping with venom and accusation. "Do you remember her, John?" The voice was calm, but there was an underlying fury in it that made John's blood run cold. "Do you remember what you did? How you killed her?" John staggered backward, his heart pounding in his chest. His legs felt weak, his knees threatening to give way. His head spun, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. But the shadow didn't let him escape. It followed his every movement, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "You couldn't even say goodbye, could you? You couldn't admit that it was your fault." The words hit him like a physical blow. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the floor, his hands shaking as he clutched at the carpet beneath him. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing in, the shadow towering above him, suffocating him. The truth, the horrible, ugly truth, was crashing over him, and he had nowhere to run. It was true. The accident. The night she had died. He remembered it all in a rush, the image of her in the passenger seat, laughing, the car speeding down the winding road, the rain falling in sheets, the headlights blinding him. He remembered the moment when he lost control, the sickening sound of tires screeching on wet pavement, the shattering glass, the sickening thud of metal crumpling, and then silence. And then the guilt. The weight of it had been too much for him to carry. He had abandoned her, left her broken and bleeding on the side of the road, too terrified to call for help, too ashamed to admit what had happened. And when the police arrived, he told them the story he'd crafted, the story of a freak accident, a moment of bad luck. But he knew the truth. He had killed her. He had taken her life, and he had never once owned up to it. The shadow loomed over him now, its voice growing louder, more accusatory. "You didn't even mourn her. You buried it all. You buried her. And now you're paying for it." John's breath was ragged as he struggled to sit up. His hands shook uncontrollably, his body drenched in cold sweat. The shadow was still there, towering over him, a reflection of everything he had refused to face, everything he had run from. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a part of him, a part of his soul that had festered and grown dark and powerful until it had become something real, something that could never be ignored. The room grew colder, the darkness deeper, until it felt as though the very air was being sucked out of him. He looked into the shadow, his eyes wide with terror, and he realized, too late, that there was no escape. The truth was too much for him to bear. The shadow had become him, and as the darkness closed in, swallowing him whole, John finally understood. It was never the shadow that had been following him. It was his own soul, and it had come to claim him. The weight of the shadow was crushing, pressing down on John's chest like 1,000 tons of stone. Every breath felt like a struggle, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. He could no longer escape it. The walls seemed to close in, pulsing with the rhythm of his heart, a constant reminder of the guilt and terror that had consumed him. The shadow loomed over him like an executioner, its presence suffocating, its darkness unrelenting. He had tried to fight it, to push it away, but it had taken root in his soul, twisting and growing stronger every day. John's mind, fragile from weeks of sleepless nights and constant torment, finally snapped. The constant voice, the accusing, venomous words that had spoken through the shadow had driven him to the edge. He could no longer differentiate between the shadow's whispers and his own thoughts. The guilt had become too much. The shadow had won, and in a fit of madness, John made a decision. He would end it. He would end it all. His hands trembled violently as he reached for the old knife in the kitchen drawer, the cold steel glinting in the dim light. It was the same knife his uncle had used to carve Sunday roast for the family, another relic of the past, now stained with his own despair. He could feel the shadow hovering behind him, waiting, watching, but he refused to look back. He refused to acknowledge it any longer. The only thing he could focus on was the cold, hard blade in his hand. He stumbled into the living room, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. The room seemed to warp around him, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, reaching for him. His eyes blurred with tears, his heart racing in his chest, but still he gripped the knife tighter, willing himself to do it. He would cut it all away. He would destroy the shadow, sever the bond between him and his past. But the closer he got to the center of the room, the more the shadow seemed to envelop him. It wasn't just an abstract presence anymore. It was everywhere. It wrapped around him, a suffocating cloak of darkness. The floor beneath him seemed to disappear, replaced by a cold void. His vision swam as the shadow began to grow, morphing into something much larger, much more terrible. It was no longer just a dark figure. It was a grotesque, twisting mass of inky tendrils, each one stretching toward him like the claws of a beast, each one lashing out, clawing at his sanity. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His mouth was dry, his throat tight with terror. The shadow's voice filled his mind, louder now, its tone mocking, triumphant. "You can't escape me, John," it said, its words dripping with malice. "You never could. You're mine. You've always been mine." In that moment, something in John's mind shattered completely. The weight of the guilt, the endless echo of the shadow's voice, it was too much. His vision blurred again, but this time it wasn't just the shadow. It was his life, his past. It all rushed back in a torrent, a blur of memories and images he had buried deep within himself. The car crash, her body, cold and lifeless, the lie he had told, the guilt that had festered inside him like a wound that never healed. And now, standing before him, was the manifestation of everything he had ever tried to escape, the shadow of his own soul. It was too much to bear. John raised the knife, his hand shaking violently, the blade gleaming in the dim light. He closed his eyes, ready to plunge it into his chest to end the torment. But before he could, the shadow lunged. It wasn't just a movement, it was everything. It was the weight of every regret, every moment of cowardice, every lie he had told. It engulfed him, pulling him into its dark embrace, swallowing him whole. The knife fell from his hand, clattering to the floor as John collapsed to his knees, his body convulsing. The shadow pressed in, suffocating him, smothering him with its darkness. And then, in an instant, everything went black. John's body lay motionless on the floor, his eyes wide open, frozen in the final grip of his own despair. The house fell silent, the only sound the distant creak of the old wood. But the silence didn't last long. The shadow lingered. It wasn't content to let him go. No, the shadow had claimed him, not just in life, but in death. It had become a part of him, an extension of his very being. And now that John was gone, the shadow would continue to live, to feed on the darkness that had taken root in this house. In the weeks that followed, the town of Chesterfield began to notice a change. The house where John had lived, his old, crumbling home, stood empty, but something wasn't right. It was no longer just an abandoned house. It was a place that felt alive with an unsettling presence. The windows were always dark, as if the house itself was watching, waiting. The air around it seemed to thicken, as if the very land surrounding the house had been tainted by the darkness within. And then, one by one, people started disappearing. It started with the local teenagers who would dare to sneak into the house, drawn by rumors of its dark history. But no one ever saw them leave. And the strange thing was, no one seemed to remember them. It was as though the house had consumed them, erasing their existence entirely, leaving behind nothing but empty space. The shadow that had once plagued John was no longer just an apparition. It had grown, taking on a life of its own, and it was waiting. It was waiting for the next person, someone to step inside, to feel the weight of the guilt that lingered, to let it consume them the way it had consumed John. The house was empty, but it would never be truly alone. And in the stillness of the night, in the black corners of the rooms where John had once lived, the shadow waited, a dark, whispering presence, always hungry for the next victim.